decades, we've been asking the wrong question. Are UFOs real? And now, for the first time in modern history, the answer is yes. They are real. They are being tracked. They are being recorded. And they are being investigated. But that answer doesn't actually tell us anything, because saying something is unidentified is not the same as understanding what it is. And that's where the problem begins, because we're still approaching this as if we're looking for objects, something physical, something built, something we can point to and say that's what it is. But what if that assumption is wrong? What if we're not observing objects at all? What if we're observing something else entirely? Welcome back to UFO to UAP, the Disclosure Report. I am your host, Matt Tones, and today's episode is titled The Unknown Itself. What are we actually observing? The term UFO has always been misleading, not because it's incorrect, but because of what people think it means. Unidentified flying object. That's all it ever meant. It never meant alien. It never meant advanced technology. It never meant anything extraordinary. It just meant we saw something and we couldn't identify it. But that definition doesn't hold anymore because modern encounters are different. This isn't just someone looking up into the sky and seeing a light. These are multi-sensor events, tracked on radar, captured on infrared, confirmed visually by trained pilots. And when those systems all agree, the conversation changes, because now we're not asking, did someone misidentify something? We're asking what kind of thing produces that kind of data. And this is why the terminology shifted from UFO to UAP, unidentified aerial phenomena. And that word matters because a phenomenon is not necessarily an object. A phenomenon is an event, something that happens, something that may not behave like a physical thing at all. And once you make that shift, everything starts to change, because now you're not just looking for a craft, you're trying to understand behavior, movement without propulsion, acceleration without transition, objects that appear, stop, change direction, and then disappear, not gradually, instantly. And this is where the pattern begins, because these aren't isolated observations. They repeat across decades, across countries, across completely independent systems. The same characteristics keep appearing: extreme speed, no visible propulsion, no heat signature that matches known engines, sharp directional changes that would destroy any known aircraft, and sometimes movement between air and water without any visible transition. Individually, each of these can be explained away: sensor error, misidentification, unknown aircraft. But when they appear together consistently over time, they stop looking like errors. They start looking like something else, something structured, something real. And this is where things become uncomfortable, because now we're not just dealing with unknowns, we're dealing with limits: the limits of our systems, the limits of our models, the limits of how we interpret what we see. Because even with all this data, we still don't understand it. We have the observations, we have the recordings, we have the patterns, but we don't have the explanation. And that creates a gap, not a gap in evidence, a gap in understanding. And that gap is where everything else lives. So, how do we explain it? There are a few ways people try to make sense of this. The simplest explanation is misidentification. That's what we're seeing, is something extraordinary being misunderstood. Sorry, that should say is something ordinary being misunderstood. Aircraft, drones, balloons, atmospheric effects, and in many cases that's true. Some sightings are misidentified, some are errors, some are explainable. But this explanation starts to break down when multiple systems confirm the same object, when trained pilots describe consistent behavior, when radar, infrared, and visual confirmation all align. At that point, it becomes much harder to dismiss. The second explanation is that these are advanced human technologies, black projects, highly classified systems operating far beyond what's publicly known. And this idea has weight because we know governments operate in secret. We know advanced technologies are developed out of public view. We know there are systems we're not told about. But this explanation also has limits because the performance being described would require breakthroughs in physics that have not been publicly demonstrated. Instant acceleration, no propulsion, no heat signature. That's not just advanced, that's different. And then there's the third explanation, the one people are most uncomfortable with, that some of these phenomena may not originate from human technology at all. Now, that doesn't mean extraterrestrial. It doesn't automatically mean alien. It means unknown. Something outside current frameworks, something we don't yet understand, something that doesn't fit neatly into the categories we've created. And that's the key problem. We keep trying to force this phenomenon into categories that may not apply. Because what if it's not one thing? What if we're not dealing with a single explanation? What if we're dealing with multiple phenomenon happening at the same time? Some misidentified, some advanced human systems, and some genuinely unknown. That would explain the inconsistency, why some cases are easily explained and others remain completely unresolved. And it would explain something else, why the data feels fragmented, why the conclusions don't align, why the narrative never quite settles. Because we may be trying to solve one mystery when we're actually dealing with several. Now, this brings us to another problem. Seeing something is not the same as understanding it. Even highly trained observers interpret what they see based on what they already know. And when something behaves outside those expectations, sorry, the brain tries to make sense of it anyway, sometimes correctly, sometimes not. But now we have sensors, and sensors change everything because sensors don't rely on perception, they detect signals, heat, motion, electromagnetic activity. But even sensors don't give us answers, they give us data, and that data still needs to be interpreted. Radar can be spoofed, infrared can misread, optical systems can distort distance and speed. So even with advanced systems, uncertainty remains. But when multiple sensors confirm the same thing, that uncertainty starts to shrink. And this is where things become difficult to dismiss because now it's not just a person seeing something, it's multiple systems detecting the same event. And still, we don't know what it is, which brings us back to the gap. We have the data, but we don't have the understanding. And that's the real issue, because the problem isn't lack of evidence, the problem is lack of explanation. We're observing something real, but we don't yet have the framework to explain it. And that leads to a deeper question. What if the limitation isn't the phenomenon? What if the limitation is us? Our assumptions, our models, our expectations of how things should behave. Because if something doesn't follow those expectations, we either reject it or try to force it into a category that fits. But what if it doesn't fit? What if we're observing something that doesn't behave like an object? What if it's an effect? Something interacting with our systems, something producing signatures without being a physical craft in the way we understand it. That would explain some of the inconsistencies, the way objects appear and disappear, the way they move without propulsion, the way they don't produce expected signatures. It wouldn't answer the question, but it would change how we approach it. And that's where language becomes important, because the words we use shape how we think. When we say craft, we imagine vehicles. When we say technology, we imagine engineering. But when we say phenomenon, we leave space. Space for uncertainty, space for possibilities that don't fit within our current understanding. And that's where we are. We know something is being observed. We know it behaves in ways we don't fully understand. We know it's been recorded across multiple systems, but we don't know what it is. And until we do, everything else remains open. The theories, the speculation, the explanations. All of it sits on top of one simple truth. The phenomenon is real. The data is real. The uncertainty is real. And until we understand the difference between what we see and what it actually is, the unknown remains exactly that. And maybe that's the most important point of all, because before we ask who's hiding the truth, before we ask what governments know, before we ask what exists inside classified programs, we have to confront something much more fundamental. We don't yet understand what we're looking at. And until we do, every answer will always be incomplete. Next time, we go deeper, because if the phenomenon resists explanation, then the next question is unavoidable. Are we even equipped to understand it?